Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out Devex.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development. Welcome to another week of conversation about what's happening in global development news. Great to be with everybody. We've got two special guests this week. Ruben Abraham is with me. He's a good friend and the CEO of Arta Global. A lot of Devex readers certainly know you, Ruben, by reputation, if not personally, for the work you do at Arta Global and for your longtime work in think tank efforts studying the effect of development finance, international development finance flows, and all things global development. It's great to have you here. Hi, Ruben.
Thanks, Raj. Good to be here.
And we've also got Nasra Ismail with us. Hey, Nasra, welcome back to another episode.
Hi, Raj. Always good to be back with the Devex team.
And Nasra is a humanitarian expert. You've worked across bilateral aid agencies and NGOs, and it's great to have you again this week as we tackle what has been another busy week of news in the global development landscape. Maybe we could just start, Ruben, with you, because I want to tap into your expertise on international finance, development finance. We had this big summit this week in Paris that President Emmanuel Macron put on, and Devex, our own Vince Chadwick, was there covering it. And it was a moment to take stock of the international financial system, to look at the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks. Did you pay some attention to this? What do you think comes out of the Paris Forum?
Yeah, Raj, unfortunately, I've been traveling, so I wasn't clued into this. But, in my travels, which has been primarily to Asia, there's obviously a lot of questions being asked around the structure of the international system and the consistent theme that you hear, certainly in Asia, is when people say the rules-based world, whose rules? And I think that question of whose rules, which has been taken to be, broadly speaking, understood in the past, I think is going to be hotly contested in the future. So I think that whose rules question actually has ramifications for the entire sort of international architecture, so to speak.
Yeah, and one of the themes, the context shifts I think that's happening right now is, we're in a different economic world order, let's say, right? Interest rates are way up from where they were a year ago in the rich world, but that's, impacted developing countries as well. And we had a story this week from Shabtai Gold talking about how this new reality of potentially slower growth, of higher interest rates, could mean that efforts like financial inclusion that have seen so much progress in the last decade kind of come off, and that we see some slowing progress. And this is something I know you work a lot on and know a lot about, being based in India, where we have one of the world's largest digital ID infrastructure, and now maybe it's the world's largest financial inclusion infrastructure too. How do you see the financial inclusion space developing, Ruben, in the current context?
Well, when you say largest and India, that's no surprise, right? If you've got the largest population, then chances
Very
are.
true.
But no, I mean, jokes aside, I think what has been built out by way of digital public infrastructure in India is truly astounding. And at some level, to me, it is actually quite shocking how little people outside of India know about what's been built. And it's not just India; it's also Brazil. It's a bunch of places that have built this financial architecture. So just to give you a sense of, so the biometric ID was the first layer of the stack. Now, what has been built is something called the Unified Payments Interface, which is a real-time bank-to-bank payment platform without your act. So it's completely open and interoperable. So what I mean by that is So if you think about email, when I email you or you email me, I don't need to know what client you're or what server you are. We can just talk to each other. That was the early architecture of the internet. Since then, it's moved to the world of chat, say, where if I need to speak to you on WhatsApp, you need to be on WhatsApp as well. And the minute you do that, you basically get monopolies because of network effects. It's the same in the world of payments. So, for instance, in the US, you've got Venmo, but for you to be able to send money to somebody, you need to be on the Venmo ecosystem. And the same goes for Alipay and WeChat in China and so on. What the Indians have basically built is a completely open and interoperable system, which basically means that anyone can send money to anybody on any platform or any app without actually knowing any detail beyond your mobile phone number. So, just to give you the final numbers on this, I mean, I was just looking at the numbers from last month. It has in the month of May, there were 9.5 billion transactions done just in 1 month, and a value of close to $200 billion have basically been transacted, and this is growing at a fairly fast clip. The growth in the infrastructure. And if you go back to 2015, when about 35 to 40% of India was actually fully banked, I remember some World Bank predictions from that time basically said that it would take 45 to 46 years for India to get 100% banked. In reality, basically, India's got as close to 100% banked as possible by 2021. So, in about 6 to 7 years, they actually closed the gap.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And it's an interesting juxtaposition. It's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on today's show because, coming from India and sitting there, you see a very different perspective, perhaps, than what gets discussed in a place like Paris at the forum this past week
Exactly.
here in Washington, D.C., because there's rapid progress. On the other hand, there's also a huge gap still. I think the piece we published said there's still 500 million people on the continent of Africa, for example, that are not included in the formal financial economy. Nasser, you spent a lot of time there. You were, CARE's country director
Mm.
in Somalia, and you were country director for Oxfam in Kenya, among many other hats you've worn over the years. How do you see the financial inclusion landscape in East Africa or in Africa more broadly?
Yeah.
And when you think about some of what Ruben just described for India, does it connect for you?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this discussion and particularly that proximate lens that you're using, Ruben. These meetings obviously brought everyone's been covering them. They get a lot of limelight. The fact that they're held in Paris, sends a kind of signal in terms of like where these issues are most going to be convened around. I think when it comes to climate is where everything, all the rosy, colored frames really fall apart because the impact and the inequity that it surfaces means that despite the restructurings that are happening at the highest global level, the impacts are not going to be equal. The impacts are hard felt throughout Africa, particularly as we see malnutrition rising all over East and West Africa. And so I think to me, what was really interesting, Raj, and I thought of you as I was like watching clips of it is, despite the conversations on the hard parts of not only the restructuring of the debts, but also the restructuring and what happens to the World Bank and all the other multilateral institutions that are sort of at the foundational level of what gets discussed and how they discuss. Ultimately, my key takeaways were these were arguments, convenings, polite diplomatic discussions that were also about who makes the rules and whether the rulemaking is actually even fair. The interventions from the Kenyan president to the Zimbabwean president, the president of Zambia, and of course our all-star incredible orator that is Mia Motley from Barbados, they were questioning not just the structure, not just the debt, and not just the inequitable aspects of the financing, but also the governing of bodies like this and obviously convenings like this. And so I found actually the juxtaposition of those hard truths and soft truths to be quite powerful because ultimately the success of how debt is restructured, how financing is done, and who gets to meaningfully benefit from the financing paradigms, ultimately it's also the strength and voice of the president who represents those communities. And so just the fact that the Kenyan president called out quite powerfully that there's an inequity in how the governing of these boards are done, especially when Ajay, is in the room as as he's on his first few months of being the head of the World Bank. I thought that was significant, and I think that those conversations are going to be remembered for a very long time. We haven't seen these kinds of interventions, at least for my time, where African governments are saying, we don't want to just be here just to ask for money. We need to help govern and be part of this governing body of the world and its financing. And so I think I'm impressed by what those conversations have made have come to, but also what they will mean ultimately in the hard truths of how money will be spent, how restructuring will be spent, and whose debt ultimately gets to be waived.
I guess there's the macro question of how the international system is structured, how fair or equitable it is. And certainly one of the attractive points about Ajay Banga being nominated as president of the World Bank was that he did spend most of his life in India. And it kind of gave a different lens potentially to his presidency. The other side of this coin, besides the macro side, is the micro, and there the focus on localization. We had a few stories this week about USAID's effort around localization comes into focus. And I think about, Ruben, some of what you talked about around financial inclusion. It's just such a different era for localization, when in the past it would have been hard to find ways to work with local partners or to localize programs. And now you can very directly identify, digitally ID, send money with very little transaction cost, if any. I guess, how are you seeing this localization question from your perspective, sitting in India and thinking about the region where you operate, Ruben?
So again, Raj, I think, and this may be a uniquely kind of Indian/Asian lens on this, but I mean, shouldn't it have been local all along? I mean, this idea that somebody sitting in Washington or somebody sitting in London had more insight on a local level problem was, I think, is when you think about it objectively, I mean, that should never have been the case, right? So I think this is where I think a lot of these things need to be fundamentally rethought. So if and this is where I think Stefan Durkon's recent book about elite buy-in and so on should be made kind of compulsory reading for people, because that is something that, for instance, if you live in these places, instantly, right? I mean, without the elite buy-in, you actually get nowhere. So I think localization is something that should always have been a priority. And if the reason to not have localization is because you believe that there are capacity and capability gaps, then the effort should have been to actually build those capacity, capability, institutional governance capacity locally. This idea that this stuff could be done remotely, I think it's well past its use by date, and I hope at least I hope this USAID move and so on pushes in that direction. Now, certainly in India and Asia, this is not even a conversation anymore, right? I mean, no one talks about this.
I so appreciate that, Ruben, and I think that sentiment is well felt. It's almost this is what's a little insane about the localization discussion. Depending on which region in the world you're in, some of it feels like it's just the beginning of a conversation. Some of it feels like this is actually going to set us back. We cannot, in 2023, have a discussion about the value and worth and role of local actors. As you say, Ruben, this is a non-starter, and in fact, no one outside of your area, India, should be thinking about not just doing work, but implementing real public service type roles that work with government. And so I think it's just but the conversation lags depending on where you are. Last time, Raj, you and I talked about this, it was more on, how much of the goal, the 25% goal, can USAID really come through? And I think even with their report a couple of weeks ago, the progress is incremental, but it's not insignificant. To push nearly $1.5 billion out of their coffers to local actors. I mean, that is a baseline. That is not the goal. That is not the outcome. But the questions have been, for many of us who follow this discussion, what helped USAID to, even as small as it is, make that move? And can we build systems and new rules around it so that it doesn't get stuck, in the words of Cass Sunstein, in the sludge of bureaucracy? So that was kind of one thing that I've been thinking through, so that in places like Asia, where this is kind of an abnormality, that Africa can also join. But with Africa, you get this really strange thing about like local actors, these presumptions. Local actors don't have capacity. If they do have capacity, it's just at a certain level, and they want to cap it, their financial absorption at a certain level, unlike the international NGOs. And so you find that discussion unhelpful. But I almost appreciate the fact that in Asia, it's something altogether abnormal, and maybe we all should be heading towards India. Lots of lessons from India.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends obviously on how big the economy is we're talking about and how important bilateral aid is. Obviously, in India, it's completely unimportant. It's very small. But in many other countries, including in East Africa, you'll find bilateral aid is big. And so, USAID policy actually can matter a lot. And it's interesting that Ruben, you brought up Stefan Durkheim. Actually, your timing is great as a plug for the Devex Book Club, which we just published today. My episode interviewing Stefan about his book Gambling on Development. And just to underline your point, Ruben, he gets into this idea that in the end, if you want to achieve development goals, you've got to find out who at the local level has actual influence.
Yeah.
And these are elites in a sense, right? These might be village elders, these might be business leaders, these might be community or faith leaders. But there are people in every community, wherever you might live in the world, that have outsized influence. And if they're not bought in to whatever the development paradigm is, to whatever the initiative or project is, chances are it's not going to last very long. It's not going to have long-term effects. And in Stefan's many years studying these issues, this is kind of the core underlying theme. It's another way of talking about localization. And as you say, it's kind of plainly obvious, you would think. Yet, our system is not structured that way. And for, good reasons, maybe not good normatively, but for reasons, that come out of the history of how the world is unequal and how, these institutions were set up to begin with, Ruben.
Yeah, I mean, it's also in the incentive structures, right? The incentive structures keep it a certain way. So to your point about, it depends on the size of the economy. No, absolutely true. But then the question you've got to ask is, how did India or China get to the point where bilateral aid was no longer necessary, right? That is the most important question to ask then. And then the question then becomes, okay, how does a Kenya get to where India and China are today, where bilateral aid is not consequential anymore?
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Adva Saldinger. I'm a senior reporter at Devex, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of Devex Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
What about multilateral aid, Ruben? What do you think, Nasser brought up the World Bank and Ajay Banga, and obviously the focus this week and some of our reporting highlighted it, is how do you get these multilateral banks to do more quote unquote innovative finance, right? To unlock private sector investment in economies. What's your feeling about that debate and how it's going and whether real progress is being made?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think again, the World Bank, if it could think of itself more as certainly on the finance side, if it could think of itself more in a catalytic sense, I think we would actually get a lot of bang for the buck. I mean, a good example of this within the World Bank system is MIGA, right? I mean, MIGA is actually, in my opinion, is severely underappreciated in terms of what it could actually be doing.
Right. And it's the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. I think I have that right.
That's right.
Which is essentially like the insurance arm of the World Bank, right? That can help insure a project against political risk. Let's say you're building a power plant and the government changes. Will you as an investor get paid back? Well, if you have a MEGA guarantee, that might make you feel more comfortable going forward, even if there's an election coming up in a couple of years.
Exactly. And so in my past life, for instance, when we experimented with instruments like first loss guarantees. I mean, it is very, it is very consequential, things like first loss guarantees, insurance, and so on, in terms of the amount of private capital it unlocks because you're backstopping any potential downside. And then you very quickly realize the difference between the perception of risk and real risk. So what you end up with is actually, in a lot of contexts, what you actually get is mispriced risk. And so there is a role for somebody to actually reprice risk, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had an opinion article published on Devex this week by quite a who's who of presidents of international agencies. Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, is one of the signatories. Werner Hoyer, the head of the European Investment Bank, and several other, major international agencies, from the IDB to the African Development Bank and Islamic Development Bank, because they were all touting a new platform they're calling the Health Impact Investment Platform. It's a bit short on details, but essentially the idea is to use innovative finance like first loss guarantees to get countries to be able to invest more in their primary healthcare systems. And part of the idea there, this gets to the question of mispriced risk, Ruben, is if countries can have a stronger primary health system, you actually save money in the long run.
Correct.
You've less cases that have to go to secondary or tertiary care. But yet there's this kind of market failure. There's not enough money going into primary healthcare systems. So there's this big new announcement, again, a little bit light on details, but we're happy to have it published in our pages, and it's interesting news this week. And I guess, just to open it up to both of you, when you think about this question and the Paris Forum and where it collides with basic things like health, any takeaway from that piece or from anything else you saw this week, Ruben or Nasra?
Maybe I can jump in here. At the end of the day, keeping communities, not only healthy, but educated enough to then really make sure that these countries around the world, doesn't really matter which part of the world they're in, but that they can be competitive and they can be healthy. I think there's just more of an urgency that I feel like we're all paying attention to this, and governments are not sharing that. This idea of not only repackaging financing, but also looking at the quality of financing, where it's coming from, and then how it actually meets the needs of your local community. This was central in one of the, I think, probably neglected conferences that happened a few months ago in Kenya. This was the Mo Ibrahim Philanthropy Forum. And it was such a interesting discussion because, one, it was an African philanthropist holding his own African continent and some of the premier leadership to account on questions like this. What are you doing with money? Where you're asking for better restructuring of debt and better restructuring of packages from the global north. How are you using them to solve local issues? A lot of them being in the social policy arena. And quite frankly, one of the things that was very hopeful about that discussion was, one, to have those conversations where they need to be had was one thing, and that sent a really clear cultural signal for those of us who are in Africa. And then two, to really think about where can you find innovation in the systems where, yes, you've got conflict, you have major governance issues, you have major instability in parts of East and West Africa. You've got to think about how do you innovate locally, meaning using your local talents. I thought the conversation, both in what you said, Raj, but also that is happening more and more among Africans, is we've got to find better uses of the money that we already have. And where we need to fight better, we've got to fight better and negotiate better at the global north, which I believe happened in the Paris summit. But ultimately, it comes down to, can you feed your people? Can you keep your country stable and peaceful? And can you educate your young people? That is the future, and I'm hopeful about where this conversation is going. The sense of urgency is something that I'm surprised by, and I hope it continues.
Yeah, we had another interesting piece this week that you make me think of, Nasra, when you talk about the quality of funding and not just kind of the headline announcement. So the Global Fund, which is one of the more effective agencies in development history, both in terms of getting the political backing for funding for HIV and TB and malaria, but also in working directly with countries. They get proposals from countries and they try to build the national health system to combat these diseases. They announced as part of their new strategy that they're going to try to link up their efforts on combating those three diseases with non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular disease and cancer. And it's an interesting idea because you first might think, well, are they losing sight of their mission and their focus? But actually, they're taking an agency that's pretty effective, and they're saying, ultimately, if you look at what's happening to people living with HIV or with TB, the big story is comorbidity. People are getting multiple issues at once, multiple health issues that are connected, and so they have to address them. And actually, in a way, it's an exciting thing because if you get the Global Fund with its effective model to focus on these other disease areas that might normally be neglected, maybe you make some real progress. And it's kind of counterintuitive in a sense when you think of the architecture of our space and everyone having their own lane to swim in. But actually, this kind of cross-cutting approach may be the thing that makes the most sense from here.
Absolutely, and the word is it's integration. I remember years ago when I was with the U.S. government, we were looking at a country like Mongolia with all of the mining, industry and all of the sort of hard infrastructure that it had invested in mining and other areas. But ultimately, Raj, its citizens were dying from exactly what you said: non-communicable diseases, diabetes, other types of cardiovascular issues, car crashes. They had one of the highest rates of losing young people or creating disabilities that came from traffic incidents. And so you end up sort of saying, we can fix the whole healthcare system, might even think about how do you help govern your institutions like the Ministry of Health and Education. Or you can really say, but where are people losing lives and productive lives? And it was all non-communicable diseases. So I actually hope with this organization going a more integrated route, and it will actually also be a more complex route, that there is a model where you cannot just have programs that are siloed. You've got to integrate, you've got to think about centering the person and the population's issues. Where it might be climate, it also might be, conflict. Where it may not be conflict, it might be corruption. But we can no longer afford to just have our eye on it and a specialty role that we play. One of the books that's, I think, kind of getting everyone excited, speaking about books for the book club. Ezra Klein recently interviewed Jennifer Palka, one of the former White House political appointees, but also the former founder of Code for America. And she has this incredible book called Recoding America: Why Government is Failing in the Digital Age and How We Can Do Better. That conversation was so seminal in terms of where we are and how we think about government, not just in America, but really around the world. And ultimately, she's making a case to coming down to the choices that we make around policy and implementation. There's so much in the context of governance that can be very confusing and very bureaucratic, but ultimately, can you execute and implement on a policy level? And we seem to be failing on that. And I don't think that's just an issue in American government. I think that's an issue with all governments having to realign their ambition in the world that we're in today, which is a very different world in the last 3 years than we have, let's say, in the last 30.
Yeah, it does feel like we're in a different moment, right? With the way the macroeconomy has shifted and the geopolitical situation has shifted so much. It's been a big week of news. We've gotten to some of it here. But Ruben, before we go, I'd love to get just your take on one of the big items in the past week, which was the visit of Prime Minister Modi to the United States to meet with President Biden and to address Congress. And he had a big week here. What was it like to see that from India, and what's your perspective on what India's kind of rising role, including its presidency of the G20, might mean for the development landscape?
So I think in the midst of the gloomy news globally, I think India is in a very interesting spot because there's a whole bunch of things that are happening that are hugely beneficial for India. Starting with China, and so if you had to look for one word that explains why this trip to Washington was as big a deal as it was, and a state visit and all of that, it just comes down to one thing, which is China. As the world tries to de-risk away from China, I think in many ways India will be the main beneficiary of the de-risking. You can see that already Apple has moved a significant minority of its production lines to India. The hope is that what I've heard from them is that up to 17 to 20% of their production of iPhones is going to be in India by 2025 or thereabouts. So there's supply chain shifting, there's geopolitics shifting. And all of this also means that, that India perhaps is the one country that is able to actually currently buy Russian oil without facing any real sanctions. And amazingly enough, actually resell the Russian oil back to the Europeans. So that tells you a great deal about where India is at right now. And look, at the end of the day, it's all driven by the fact that it is the fastest growing large economy in the world. So just having growth actually helps you a great deal in terms of geopolitics. So if you ask me for one recommendation for what African countries could do as well, it would be the same, which is grow. And when you grow and the economy grows and all of those things, good things happen, then a lot of the stuff that we've discussed on this in this conversation actually starts to fall into place. And that's what we've certainly realized with India, is that post 91 started growing, went from a tiny, relatively tiny economy to the fifth largest economy in the world, soon to be the third largest economy in the world. I think this stuff actually helps, and that's where I think some of these conversations need to basically ask the question of how did India and China get to the place that they are, and how did the single biggest reduction in poverty happen in China? I think those are to me, are the really interesting questions.
Yeah,
there are south to south lessons here. Sorry, Rod, just wanted to have an opportunity to say something here. I think, Ruben, you make definitely a case, and it's been happening over the last decade. But there's also another urgency in terms of like what south to south learning looks like in terms of growth on the economic level and reduction on harm. But I also would probably caution the example of growth by all means, because we also know it's part of Modi's visit to the U.S. I know a number of lawmakers, particularly those representing Muslim communities, were also rightfully questioning the platform and saying, where's the responsibility with Modi's inside his own home in terms of some of the minority nations that are some of the minority communities in his nation. And so I think it's a cautioning. It's not a complete disagreement, but for sure, in terms of economic growth and the ability to face your own plight, but also pay your own bills, there's definitely lots of lessons there. But ultimately, also in terms of the largest democratic country around the world, it's also important to caveat and caution that it's not growth by all means, but it's growth that also respects human rights and makes sure that we're able to all live together. But I take your point. I wish we had more time to do this.
Yeah, I would just a couple of quick thoughts as we close up here. You mentioned, Ruben, de-risking with China, and you're right on the language that the Biden administration is using. They're talking about de-risking as opposed to decoupling. They're trying to create this middle ground, and you're right. India is certainly finding itself as kind of the indispensable country. Everyone needs to have a relationship, including, as you say, both Russia and Europe, which is a very unusual place for India to find itself in. And it does beg the question, can this growth engine in India, and that you see in other countries too that have a similar demographic dividend? I think the median age in India is 26 years old, I think, something like that.
28.
28. So it's similar with Nigeria and other and some other large economies that are growing. And the question is this new era we're in of higher interest rates, potentially slower global growth, a transition to a green economy, will countries like India be able to use this as an opportunity to both grow and, as Nasser says, develop? So it's a big macro story. We've touched on it a little bit in our discussion today and in some of our coverage this week, but it's been great to have a chance to chat with the two of you. Thank you for joining us, and thanks everyone for listening in for This Week in Global Development.
Wonderful. Thanks, Raj. Thanks, Ruben.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a Devex Pro member by going to devex.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.